The water had come without warning, the way all the worst things did, and by the time Lucy Garner climbed to the top of the ridge and looked down at what used to be her husband's land, the valley below was a broad, shimmering mirror that reflected nothing but a sky she no longer trusted. She stood there for a long time. The wind off the Colorado high country was cold even in late April of 1879, and it pulled her dark hair loose from the pins she had worked into it that morning before the ride out from town. She did not fix the hair. She just stood and looked at the water, which sat still and wide and indifferent across every acre that Thomas Garner had broken his back to deed in his name, and in hers before the fever had taken him the previous October. The land agent's letter had reached her 3 days ago at the boarding house in Cimarron, New Mexico Territory, where she had been staying through the winter with her daughter Clara, who was 7, and her son Will, who was 9. The letter was written in the clean, careful hand of a man who clearly enjoyed delivering bad news with good penmanship. It informed Lucy that the Garner property in the Mora Valley, some 40 miles east of the mountains, had been subjected to significant flooding as a result of the unusually heavy snowpack that winter, and that based on the assessment of the Territorial Land Office, the property was currently uninhabitable and, in the opinion of their surveyor, of negligible agricultural value going forward. The letter further informed her that a buyer had expressed interest in acquiring the deed at a modest price, given the condition of the land, and that she ought to consider the offer seriously, as the land was unlikely to recover to its previous productivity. The modest price the letter mentioned was $140. Thomas had paid $700 for the land 5 years ago. He had built the house with his own hands, hauling timber from the mountains on a wagon that took 2 horses and a full day each trip. He had dug the well himself, dug it by hand in the summer heat, and hit water at 40 feet deep on an August afternoon that he said was the second best day of his life, after the day Lucy agreed to marry him. She had read the letter twice, folded it back along its original creases, and set it on the table beside her coffee cup. Clara had been watching her from across the table with those wide brown eyes that missed nothing, and Will had been pretending to read the dime novel he had found somewhere, though Lucy noticed his eyes had not moved on the page. She had told them nothing alarming. She had told them they were going to go look at the land, and then they would decide what to do. She had borrowed a horse from the widow of Paling, who kept 3 and was generous about such things, and she had ridden out with Will and Clara sharing the saddle behind her, and now here she stood on the ridge looking down at the water. The valley floor was submerged. Maybe 4 feet of standing water across the low ground, maybe more in the places where the creek had historically run. The house was not visible. She could see the top of the old cedar by the east fence line, and she could see where the ridge of the barn roof broke the water's surface, and she could see the posts of the corral still standing in a ragged row. Everything else was under. Will came to stand beside her. He was a serious boy, lean and quiet in the way Thomas had been quiet, and he looked at the water without any expression she could read. "Is it all gone?" he asked. "No," Lucy said, and she meant it, though she could not have explained how she was so certain at that moment. "The water will fall, it always falls. When, by summer, the runoff will drain east once the snow stops feeding it, the soil will dry out by late summer or early fall." She paused. "We have time." "Mama," Clara said from behind her, having climbed down from the horse to stand a few feet back, "the man's letter said it was worthless." "The man who wrote that letter has never worked a piece of ground in his life," Lucy said. "He sits in an office in Santa Fe and he looks at numbers." "The land is not worthless. It is only wet." She said it calmly, without anger, because the anger was something she kept private. She had learned that from Thomas, who said that a person's anger was their own fuel, and you did not waste fuel by burning it in the open where it could not do any useful work. She turned away from the ridge and walked back to the horse and helped Clara back up and swung herself into the saddle, and they rode back toward Cimarron, while the afternoon sun dropped behind the Sangre de Cristo Mountains to the west and colored the sky a deep, burning orange that seemed to Lucy both beautiful and a little cruel. It was on the road back that they met Emmett Watkins. He was coming the other direction on a gray roan mare that had clearly been ridden hard over some distance, and he pulled up when he saw them coming around the bend because the road was narrow there, and he was the kind of man who pulled up and let others pass. He touched the brim of his hat when Lucy came abreast of him, which was a plain enough courtesy, but it was the look on his face that made her slow the borrowed horse. He was looking at the ridge she had just left, at the pale glitter of water still visible in the valley below, and his face had something on it that she recognized because she had been feeling it herself all afternoon. It was grief, but not the collapsed kind. It was the kind of grief that was still standing upright, still looking at the thing that had hurt it, which was a different thing entirely. "You been up to look?" she asked. He looked at her then. He was maybe 32 or 33, she guessed, with a broad, sun-darkened face and gray-green eyes that were honest without being soft. He wore a plain canvas coat and a hat that had been good once and was still serviceable. There was a bedroll tied behind his saddle and a rifle in the scabbard and nothing else that she could see. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Rode out from Rayado this morning. Heard the whole valley went under." He paused. "You have land down there, the Garner property. East side of the valley near the Second Creek Bend." He was quiet for a moment. "I know the place. Your husband built a white house with a green door." She felt the small, sharp catch in her chest that still came when someone mentioned Thomas casually as if he were still alive somewhere and building things. "He did," she said. "He passed last fall." "I'm sorry to hear it." He said it simply without excess, which she appreciated. "I'm Emmett Watkins. I had 40 acres on the north end, dry farming. Milo and some corn." Lucy Garner. She did not offer her hand because she was on horseback and it was awkward, but she nodded. "Were you told it's worthless?" Something moved in those gray-green eyes. "I received a letter from the land office, yes, with an offer to purchase." "A low offer." "Very low." He looked back at the valley. "I told them no." She studied him for a moment. "They told me the same thing, that it's worthless." "I know the Mora Valley soil," he said. "Rich silt that far down, fed by the snowmelt for 1,000 years. Once the water drops, that ground will grow anything you put in it." He paused again. "This kind of flooding actually deposits nutrients. The soil could be better than it was before." It was so close to what she had already been thinking that she felt a small jolt of something, surprise or recognition, she was not sure which. "How long have you worked land in the territory?" 7 years, he said. "Came out from Missouri in '72. He looked at Will and Clara, who were watching him with open curiosity. "These your children?" "Yes, Will and Clara." He nodded at them both in a respectful way that Lucy noticed. A lot of men ignored children the way they ignored furniture. He did not. "I am heading back to Cimarron for supplies," he said. "I plan to camp on the ridge above my land and wait it out. Maybe start some drainage work on the high ground to help it along." Lucy looked at him. The evening light was fading and it was cold, and there was a long ride still ahead, and she had 2 children on a borrowed horse and no very clear plan for what came next, other than the bone-deep certainty that she was not going to sell Thomas's land for $140 to a man in Santa Fe who did not know what silt meant. "I will be returning as well," she said. "In 2 weeks or so, after I make arrangements for the children with Mrs. Appling in town." He nodded. He did not tell her it was foolish or dangerous or too much for a woman alone. He simply nodded, as if the decision were hers entirely, which it was. "I will likely still be on the ridge," he said. "If you need assistance with drainage work, I am willing to help. 2 properties working together will move water faster than one." "I know how to wait for the water to fall," she said. He held her gaze for one moment longer than courtesy required. "So do I," he said. Then he clicked his horse on and rode past her toward town, and she rode toward town herself, and Will said quietly behind her shoulder, "He seemed all right, Mama," and she said, "Yes, he did," and left it at that. The 2 weeks in Cimarron were harder than she anticipated, though not for the reasons she had expected. Mrs. Appling, who was 60 and sharp-eyed and had been widowed twice and therefore treated Lucy as a fellow member of a particular serious club, agreed immediately to keep Will and Clara while Lucy went to the land. Lucy had expected that. What she had not expected was how much Will would argue about it. He was 9, and he argued the way Thomas had argued, quietly and without raising his voice, which was somehow harder to resist than shouting. He said he was old enough to help. He said he had helped his father run drainage channels behind the barn the summer before. He said that Clara could stay with Mrs. Appling, and he could come with her. Lucy sat with him at the small table in the corner of the boarding-house room where she and the children slept, and she looked at him for a long time, at his father's serious eyes and his father's set jaw, and she felt the love for him like something physical, like something she was carrying in her chest. "When the water falls and the ground is dry and the house is standing again," she said, "I will need you here, Will. I will need you to have kept your sister calm and to have helped Mrs. Appling, because she is old and her back gives her trouble. I need someone I trust completely to hold things together here while I hold things together there." He looked at the table. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You will come back." It was not a question, but it needed an answer. "I will come back," she said. "I promise you that." He nodded, accepting it, and she watched something settle in him that was already too much like the way a man settles into a hard thing, and she felt the grief of it, that he had to be so much older than 9. She arranged the rest of her affairs. She had a little money, not much. What remained of the small amount Thomas had saved, and what she had earned through the winter doing laundry and mending for families in Cimarron who could afford to pay for such services. She bought what she would need: salt pork, flour, dried beans, coffee, a good heavy oilcloth for shelter if the house was still flooded, a shovel, a hand pick, and a length of rope. She borrowed the horse again from Mrs. Appling, who pressed a second blanket on her, and also a tin of hardened maple sugar that she said was for emergencies. On the morning she left, Clara cried and Will did not, which somehow made it harder. She held them both for a long time in the yard, while Mrs. Appling stood on the porch and pretended to look at something in the distance to give them privacy. 2 months, Lucy told them. 3 at the outside. By the time the cottonwoods turn, I will be back for you. She rode east as the sun climbed the sky behind the mountains, and she did not look back because she had found that looking back made the forward motion harder, and forward was the only direction that was going to accomplish anything. The ridge above her property was different from what she had pictured during the 2 weeks in town. It was rougher, more exposed to wind, with a stand of juniper on the leeward side that offered some shelter and a flat area of rock and dry grass where she could make a reasonable camp. She tied the horse to a juniper, unloaded her gear, and spent the better part of an hour making a camp that would be livable rather than merely survivable. From the ridge, looking down, she could see the water level in the valley. It had dropped perhaps 6 inches from what she had seen 2 weeks ago. The barn roof was more visible now, and she could see the top section of the house chimney, which meant the house structure was at least partially above water on the upper end. She studied the drainage patterns of the valley below with the focused attention of someone who had been married to a man who noticed such things and had taught her to notice them too. The water was flowing slowly toward the east, following the natural grade of the valley floor. It was moving. It was going to keep moving. She was building her cook fire that evening when she heard a horse coming up the trail from the south, and she had the rifle out and was standing before she fully decided to stand. Old habit from 2 years of living in the territory, where being careless about approaching riders was the kind of mistake you only made once. It was Emmett Watkins. He saw the rifle before she lowered it, and he raised one hand, palm out, in a way that was neither startled nor afraid, just acknowledging. "Still here," he said. As promised, she lowered the rifle. Her heart was still going fast, as it always did when she pulled the weapon, and she worked to calm it. "I did not hear your camp," she said. I am on the north end of the ridge above my property." He gestured generally in that direction. "About a quarter mile. I heard your fire, thought I should introduce myself properly rather than remain a mystery." He looked at her camp, taking it in with one even glance, the way someone does who is assessing rather than judging. "You set up well," he said. "I have camped before." "I can see that." He was carrying something, she noticed. He held it out. It was a Dutch oven, battered and black and obviously his. "I made a stew, venison and dried corn, too much for one, which is usually true of stew." She looked at the Dutch oven and then at him, and she made the kind of rapid assessment that a woman alone in the territory had to make quickly and well. He was not drunk. He was not angled toward her in any aggressive way. He was holding a heavy cast iron pot with both hands and looking at her with those steady gray-green eyes and waiting. "All right," she said. "Put it on the fire." They ate sitting on opposite sides of the fire, which was civilized, with the Dutch oven between them and tin plates that she found in her pack and tin cups of coffee. The stew was very good. She told him so, and he said he had been cooking for himself for 7 years and had worked at it because there was no reasonable alternative. "You lived alone on your 40 acres, she asked. "For the last 3 years, he said. "Before that I had a partner, man named Horatio Baines. We came out from Missouri together. He decided the territory was not for him and went back east in '76. He paused. He was right that it was not for him. He was wrong that it was not for me." "What made you certain it was for you?" He thought about this, which she appreciated. He was not a man who answered immediately in order to seem decisive. He actually considered things. "The first time I turned over a strip of that valley soil," he said, "and saw what was underneath the surface, dark and fine and alive with everything that lives in good ground. I had worked poor Missouri clay for 20 years and I had never seen soil like that. I thought, this is land worth fighting for." He looked at her across the fire. "Your husband thought the same thing, I expect." "He wrote me a letter about the soil before I came out," she said. She had not talked about this with anyone and was surprised to hear herself saying it now. "He had come ahead to file the claim and begin building, and I was still in Kansas with the children. He wrote me a letter and he described the soil. Not the mountains or the sky or any of the things people usually talk about when they describe this country. He described the dirt." She felt the corner of her mouth move, not quite a smile, but the shape of one. "I thought, this is either a very boring man or a very good farmer." "Which was it?" "Both," she said, and this time it was a real smile, brief but genuine. "Both, and I loved him dearly for it." Emmett looked at his coffee cup. "I am sorry for your loss," he said again, but he said it differently this time, fuller, as if he meant it in a larger way than the first time on the road. "Thank you," she said. "He was a good man, a very good man." They sat for a while without talking, which was comfortable rather than awkward, and the fire burned down and the stars came out enormous over the high desert, and the cold settled in from the mountains. Eventually, Emmett picked up the Dutch oven and said he would come back in the morning to show her the drainage work he had started on the north end if she was interested, because the patterns connected, and it would be useful to understand the whole system. She said she would be interested. He walked back north along the ridge, his lantern making a small warm point of light that moved through the dark and then disappeared around the curve of the land. And Lucy sat for another hour feeding the fire sticks and looking down at the moonlit water in the valley below, and thinking about soil, and about the particular loneliness of knowing exactly what you want and having to wait for it. The next morning he was at her camp by the time she had her coffee made. He had his own cup. He did not presume on her supplies, she noticed, which was considerate. He had a rough map drawn on the back of an old envelope, which showed the ridge from above and the valley below and the creek beds and the approximate locations of both their properties. "The water is draining primarily through here," he said, pointing to the eastern end of the valley on his map. "And here. These 2 natural channels. But there is a ridge of clay soil running east to west here." He traced a line with his finger that is holding water on the west side. "If we cut a channel through it, even a shallow one, We can redirect some of the standing water into the eastern drain and speed things up significantly. She studied the map. She had Thomas's instinct for land and water, which she had developed not through training but through 7 years of paying close attention to someone who understood it deeply. The logic of what Emmett was showing her was sound. How deep would the channel need to be, she asked. 2 feet would do it in most places, 18 inches in a few. The grade does the work once you open the passage. How long will it take? 2 people working steadily 3 or 4 days. 1 person a week or more. She looked at him. He was looking at the map. He was not pressing. He was simply presenting information and letting her draw her own conclusions, which was the right way to do it. 2 people, she said. He looked up then. Yes, he said, 2 people. They worked. That is the simplest way to say it. They went down into the valley together each morning at first light, picking their way down the ridge trail to the edge of the standing water, and they waded in when they had to, which was cold and miserable, and they worked with their shovels on the high ground at the clay ridge Emmett had identified, cutting through it in the steady, methodical way that hard work actually gets done when you cannot rely on anything but the effort itself. The first day was exploratory, finding the exact line of the clay ridge, marking it, clearing the surface brush. The second day they began digging in earnest. The third day, which was bright and warm with a good south wind that felt like a promise, they broke through the clay at the main point, and they felt the water begin to move, and Emmett said there, quietly and with satisfaction, and Lucy understood what he meant because she felt it too, the deeply particular satisfaction of doing the right thing in the right place at the right time and feeling the land respond. They did not talk constantly while they worked. That was one of the things she noticed about him. He was not a man who filled silence with noise. He worked beside her with focused attention and spoke when there was something useful to say, and was quiet the rest of the time, and the quiet was companionable rather than cold. It reminded her of Thomas in that way, though Emmett was otherwise different from Thomas in the ways that every person is different from every other person. Thomas had been dark-haired and slight and quick to laugh. Emmett was broader and quieter and more deliberate in everything, but the quality of the silence was similar, that sense of someone whose stillness came from security rather than distance. On the 4th day, during the midday rest when the sun was directly overhead and the work was too hot to continue efficiently, they sat in the shade of the old cedar, the one she had spotted from the ridge on her first visit, the one still standing with its crown above the waterline, and they ate the cornbread she had made that morning and drank water from the canteen and talked properly for the first time, not about drainage or soil or property lines, but about the things that make a person who they are. She learned that he had grown up on a small farm outside of Independence, Missouri, the second of 4 children, and that his father had died when Emmett was 14, and his mother had run the farm herself until Emmett's younger brother was old enough to take it over, and that his mother had been a woman of considerable practical intelligence and very little patience for self-pity, and that he suspected he had learned more from watching her than from any other single source in his life. She told him about Kansas, where she had grown up, and about meeting Thomas at a church social when she was 19 and he was 23, and about the decision to come west, which had been jointly made but which Thomas had perhaps wanted slightly more than she had, and which she had come to want equally by the time they arrived. She told him about the first winter on the land, which had been genuinely frightening in its severity, and about the way Thomas had said, on the worst night of that winter when the temperature dropped to something she could not quite measure because the thermometer only went to 20 below, that the land was testing them to see if they meant it, and that they had to mean it in order to pass. "Did you?" Emmett asked. "Mean it?" "Yes." She looked out at the shimmering water covering Thomas's land and beyond it at the mountains, purple and permanent in the afternoon distance. "Yes," she said. "I meant it then. I mean it still." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I believe you." And the way he said it, without qualification or flattery, just as a plain statement of observation, did something to her that she would spend several days trying not to examine too directly. The water level in the valley dropped measurably over the following 2 weeks. The channel they had cut was working, and the continued warm south wind was evaporating the shallower sections, and the natural eastern drainage was doing its work. By the end of the 3rd week of May, the barn floor was visible, and by the 1st week of June, the yard around the house was exposed, muddy and rank and strewn with debris but solid ground. The house was standing. This was the thing she had told herself not to count on, because it was not a thing you could promise yourself in flood country, but it was standing. The lower walls were stained to a height of almost 3 feet with waterlogging, and the floorboards were buckled, and several would need replacing. And the green door that Thomas had painted green, because Lucy had said she wanted something cheerful on the front of the house. That door was swelled shut and warped in its frame. But the walls were sound, the chimney was intact, the roof had not shifted, and the structure of the house that Thomas had built with his own hands was fundamentally and obstinately present. She was standing in the yard looking at it, with mud to her boot tops and her hair loose from everything she had tried to do with it, and her work clothes stiff with dried clay, when Emmett came around the side of the barn where he had been checking the foundation logs. "Barn's solid," he said. "The foundation logs are set deep enough that they held. You will need new flooring inside, but the structure is good." She nodded. She was still looking at the house. "It is a well-built house," he said, standing beside her. "He was very careful about everything he built," she said. "He used to say that a thing done poorly had to be done twice, so you might as well do it right the first time." He was correct. She turned to look at Emmett then, and found that he was looking at the house with something on his face she had not seen before, a kind of careful, contained wanting, as if he was thinking about something just slightly beyond the house itself. He felt her looking and turned, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the afternoon light was warm, and the mud smell of the receding flood was in the air alongside something that smelled like green things beginning, like the earth uncovering itself and starting again. And she thought, very clearly and without particularly trying to, that she had not been this aware of another person's proximity since Thomas died, and that it was very inconvenient timing. She looked away first. "I should start on the floor," she said. "I have a pry bar," he said, "for the swelled planks." "You did not have to bring a pry bar." "I know," he said. "I brought it anyway." There was a man in Cimarron named Dalton Prout, who had heard what the land office letter said, and who had made it his particular business to ensure that Lucy Garner understood the wisdom of selling. She had not thought much about him during the weeks on the ridge, because she was busy, and he was not worth thinking about. But he arrived in the valley on a clear June morning riding a good horse, and accompanied by 2 other men who were neither as well dressed as him nor as polished in their manner, and who Lucy understood immediately were there for effect rather than assistance. Prout was the kind of man who had come west not to build anything, but to acquire what others had built. He had connections to the territorial land office, or claimed to, and he had a way of speaking in warm, concerned tones that was meant to make his offers sound like favors. He found Lucy in the house, where she was pulling buckled floorboards with the pry bar while Emmett stacked the salvageable ones outside. He came to the door, which was propped open because the green door was still unworkable in its frame, and he knocked on the door frame with the genial confidence of a man who expected to be welcomed. "Mrs. Garner," he said, "Dalton Prout. We met briefly at the land office meeting in November." She remembered him. She set down the pry bar and straightened up. "Mr. Prout, I heard you had come back to the property. I wanted to come out personally to renew our offer, given the improvements in the flooding situation." He paused to look around the stripped interior of the house with an expression of sympathetic skepticism. "I wonder if you have had time to consider a revised figure." "I have not considered any figure," she said. "I am not selling." He smiled the smile of someone who has heard this before and considers it the first move in a negotiation. "Mrs. Garner, I understand the attachment to the land, truly, but the practical realities." The practical realities, she said, are that the water has dropped 8 inches in the last 2 weeks, the house is sound, the barn is sound, and the soil in this valley is among the best in the territory. I am aware of the practical realities. Emmett had appeared in the doorway behind Prout. He said nothing. He simply was there, which made a different kind of statement than anything he might have said. Prout glanced back at him and then at Lucy. "I see you have help." He said it in a tone that was meant to suggest something unsavory, which was such a transparent tactic that Lucy felt contempt rather than embarrassment. "Mr. Watkins is my neighbor and business partner in the drainage work," she said, clearly and without inflection. "He has his own property on the north end of the valley." "Is that so?" Prout looked at Emmett again. "You're the Watkins with the Milo fields." "Yes," Emmett said. "We made you an offer as well." "You did. I declined." Prout looked between them with the calculating expression of a man who is revising his approach. The land office's position, Emmett said, "is not law. It is an opinion. Mrs. Garner holds the deed to this property, filed with the county. So do I. The land office has no authority to compel a sale." This was true, and Prout knew it, and the knowing of it moved across his face briefly before the genial expression returned. "Of course not," he said. "I am simply trying to be helpful. The territory is changing, friends. Railroad is coming through the eastern corridor in the next 2 years. Land values in the floodplains are going to be unpredictable for quite some time. A fair offer now is what I will make to someone who wants to buy my crops in the fall," Lucy said. "Not my land." "Never my land. Good day, Mr. Prout." He left, and his 2 men left with him, and she stood in the doorway of the half-stripped house and watched them ride back up the valley track until they were out of sight. And only when they were gone did she feel the full force of what had just happened, which was not fear but something adjacent to it, the recognition that someone with connections and motives was paying attention to her situation. Emmett was beside her, not too close, but close enough. "He will come back," he said. "I know. He will try a different approach next time. Let him." He looked at her. "You are not afraid of him." "I am a little afraid of him," she said honestly. "But being afraid is not the same as being stopped." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in a different tone than anything he had used before, lower and with something careful in it, "No, it is not the same thing at all." She looked at him then, really looked, the way she had been avoiding doing because she was not sure what she would find when she stopped being careful about it. She found a man who was watching her with the kind of attention that was not intrusive but was entirely honest, and who seemed to be, in the same moment she was taking the measure of him, also taking the measure of her, with equal care. She looked away, back at the valley, at the receding water and the dark wet ground emerging from it like a new beginning. "I should get back to the flooring," she said. "Yes," he said. "We both should." They went back to work. June moved forward in the way June does in the high desert of New Mexico territory, which is to say with heat in the afternoons and cool mornings and evenings that smelled of sage and pine from the mountains, and the particular sweetness of wet earth drying under sun. The water in the valley continued to drop. By the middle of the month, Lucy's property was entirely above water, and Emmett's north end was perhaps 90% clear. The remaining moisture in the deep low spots on his land was evaporating slowly but steadily. Lucy moved from the ridge camp into the house. The floors needed work, but she laid down the oilcloth over the worst sections, and she had the fireplace functional and the stove operable after cleaning the sediment from the flue, and she slept better in the house than she had in the tent on the ridge, because she was under the roof that Thomas had built and that the flood had not moved, and that mattered more than she could easily explain. Emmett came each day. This was simply what happened. He came in the morning, sometimes before her coffee was fully made, and he worked and she worked, and they ate together at midday and sometimes in the evening, and they talked and they did not talk, and the days moved in a rhythm that felt both recent and ancient, like something that had always been the pattern and she had only just found it. She was aware of the feeling that was growing in her. She was not the kind of woman who was vague about her own interior states. She knew what it was. She also knew it was complicated, and that complication had to be treated with respect, because it involved Thomas's memory and her children, and the fact that she had known this man for a matter of weeks, and the fact that the situation they were in was not a normal situation, and feelings that arose from shared hardship were not always the same as feelings that would survive ordinary life. She thought about all of this carefully, and she did not act on any of it, because careful was the right approach, and also because she was too busy repairing her house to do anything else. On the last Friday of June, which was a bright evening with a warm wind, and the valley below the ridge finally looking like the valley she remembered rather than a lake pretending to be one, Emmett came around in the early evening with a small string of trout he had caught in the creek, which was running clean and clear now that the flood had passed. He said he had more than he needed, and would she like some? And she said yes, and she cooked them with a little flour and salt in the cast iron pan, and made cornbread, and they ate on the front step of the house, because the house interior was still not quite right for sitting in pleasantly, and the evening was too good to be indoors anyway. The sun went down behind the mountains in a slow, spectacular collapse of color, and the first stars appeared, and the coyotes started their conversation somewhere on the eastern ridge, and Lucy said, without planning to, "I am glad you came back to this valley." He was quiet for a moment. "I am glad you did not sell," he said. He turned to look at her. "I thought about that letter you must have received, the offer they made. I thought if she sells and goes, then this whole end of the valley will be Prout's, and that is a bad outcome for the land and for everyone who might ever live here." He paused. "But I also thought, I hoped you would not sell because I wanted to meet you again." She felt the warmth of it move through her, simple and clear. "You said so, do I?" she said. He looked at her. "When, on the road, I said I knew how to wait for the water to fall. You said so, do I?" She met his eyes. "I thought about that for 2 weeks in Cimarron." "I thought about it for 2 weeks on this ridge," he said. She looked down at her hands, which were in her lap, rough from the work of the past weeks, capable hands, hands that had done a great deal. "I am a widow with 2 children and a flooded homestead," she said. "I am 30 years old, and I have no illusions about what my situation is or what it requires." "I know what your situation is," he said. "I have been sitting beside it for a month. I am telling you," she continued, "because I think clarity is more respectful than ambiguity. I am not a girl who can afford to treat feelings carelessly. Everything I do has consequences for my children." "I understand that," he said quietly. "I am not asking anything from you. I want you to know what I am thinking, which is that I have not felt this kind of," he paused, choosing the word carefully, "recognition when I am with another person in a very long time, possibly never in exactly this way." He looked at the darkening valley. "But I am also not going anywhere. My land is here. Yours is here. We are neighbors, and we will continue to be neighbors regardless of anything else, so there is no pressure in anything I am saying." She looked at him for a long time. He looked back at her steadily, without performing anything, just present and honest and entirely himself, which was, she thought, a very rare quality in a person and not something she had expected to encounter in a valley recovering from a flood. "Thomas has been gone 8 months, she said. "Yes. That is not very long." "No," he agreed. "It is not. I need more time to be certain of myself," she said. "Not because I am not," she paused herself, "not because I do not feel the recognition you are describing, because I do. But because I want to be fair to everyone, including you." He nodded slowly. "That is exactly what I would have asked for," he said, "if I had been the one to speak first." She took a breath. The evening air was cool and sweet, and the stars above the valley were coming out one by one in the darkening blue. "Then we are agreed," she said, "that we are honest with each other and that we take the time that is needed." "Agreed," he said. He left when it was fully dark, and she stood in the doorway of the house for a while after, listening to the horses' hoofbeats move north along the valley track until they faded, and she thought that the word recognition was exactly right, that it was the word she would have chosen if she had been the one speaking, and that this particular convergence was either meaningful or very good luck, and she suspected it was both. July brought heat and drying and a great deal of work. The valley soil, exactly as Emmett had predicted, was extraordinarily rich in the wake of the flooding. The silt that had been deposited across the low fields was dark and fine, and when Lucy worked it with her hands she could feel how alive it was, and she thought, as she often thought of Thomas in moments like these, that he would have been astonished and grateful. She had seed in her pack, bought with considerable care in Cimarron, knowing she would have a shortened season, but that the valley's long, warm autumns gave her a window that most places would not. She planted a kitchen garden first, the fast things, turnips, beans, squash, and a section of potatoes. She planted later corn in the field behind the barn where the soil had dried fastest. Emmett had begun replanting his milo, and on the north end of his property where the soil was slightly higher and drier, he had put in a second crop of corn. They compared their planting decisions the way farmers do, not competitively but collaboratively, each drawing on knowledge the other did not fully share, and she found that his knowledge and hers fit together in a practical way that she suspected said something beyond agriculture. Dalton Prout came back in mid-July, as Emmett had predicted he would, and this time he did not bring his 2 men and he did not come with an offer of purchase. He came with a different kind of instrument, a man named Josiah Greer, who presented himself as a water rights surveyor for the territorial government. Greer had papers, official-looking papers with seals and signatures, which declared that the flooding event of the spring had altered the natural watercourse of the Mora Valley Creek sufficiently to require a new survey of water rights in the affected area, and that during the period of the survey, which could take some months, all agricultural use of the affected parcels was technically subject to review. Lucy read the papers carefully, while Prout stood on her porch with his hands in his coat pockets looking satisfied. "What this means," Prout said in his helpful tone, "is that during the survey period your claim to the water that crosses your property is uncertain, which affects your agricultural rights, which affects the value of your land, which is a great deal of paper to say nothing that is actually binding," said a voice from behind him. Emmett had come up the track. He was on horseback and he had heard the last part of the conversation, and he dismounted and came up to the porch with a directness that was not aggressive but was very clear. "These are official documents," Greer said. "May I see them?" Emmett said. Greer looked at Prout, who gave a small nod. Emmett took the papers and read them with the careful attention of someone who reads slowly because he reads everything. Then he handed them back. "The survey provision on the Territorial Water Code applies to primary watercourses," he said. "The Mora Valley Creek is classified as a secondary watercourse under the 1875 Territorial Statute. The review provision does not apply." He looked at Prout. "I expect Mr. Greer, being a water rights surveyor, is aware of this distinction." Greer was quiet. "Furthermore," Emmett continued, "the agricultural rights on this property are tied to the land deed, not to the water classification. Mrs. Garner may plant whatever she chooses on her property during any survey period. The survey affects nothing she is currently doing." Prout's genial expression had thinned somewhat. "You seem very knowledgeable about territorial water law," he said. "I read," Emmett said simply. After they left, and they left without another word, Lucy stood on the porch watching the dust of their horses and then turned to look at Emmett, who was tying his roan to the porch post with a calm that she suspected was somewhat performed. "Is that true?" she said. "What you said about the statute?" "Largely," he said. "The secondary watercourse classification is real and the 1875 statute is real. I am somewhat less certain about the precise application to agricultural rights, but Greer clearly was not going to challenge it, which tells me he knew the papers were thin." She stared at him for a moment, and then, to her own surprise, she laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind she had not quite managed since Thomas died, full and genuine and slightly unruly, and it came out of her before she could consider it, and it felt like the cracking open of something that had been sealed for a long time. Emmett looked startled for a fraction of a second, and then he smiled, a real smile that changed his whole face, and it was a good face when it was changed like that, open and warm and somehow younger. "I read," she repeated, still laughing a little. "I did," he said. "I read everything I could find about territorial law the winter after I got Prute's first approach to my property. I thought it might be useful." "It was very useful," she said. She was calming, but the warmth of the laugh was still in her. "Thank you, Emmett." He looked at her with the smile still on his face and said, "You are very welcome, Lucy." It was the first time he had used her first name, and she noticed it, and she thought he noticed her noticing it, and it was exactly as simple and as complicated as that. She wrote to Will and Clara at the end of July, a long letter that she sent via the stage through Cimarron. She told them the house was standing and the crops were in and the water was gone and the valley was green, and that she was expecting them by late September as promised. She told Will that the barn needed some work, and that there would be plenty for him to do when he arrived. She told Clara that the kitchen garden had beans and squash, and that she had seen a red-tailed hawk nest in the cedar by the east fence, and that the young hawks had fledged but might still be in the area. She told them both that she loved them and thought about them every day, and that the land was worth the waiting, exactly as she had told them it would be. She did not mention Emmett in the letter. She was not ready to do that, and it felt important to be ready before she did. August was beautiful in the Mora Valley. The heat broke in the second week of the month, and the nights turned cool, and the days were bright and dry, and the light had that golden afternoon quality that only comes in late summer at elevation, and the crops in the valley were coming on with the extraordinary vigor of plants in newly enriched soil. Lucy's beans were heavy on their vines, and the squash sprawled magnificent and inevitable across half the kitchen garden, and the corn was shoulder-high and showing silk. She and Emmett fell into a pattern that was no longer simply practical. She would sometimes ride north to his property in the morning to check his milo, which she had become genuinely interested in because she had never worked with the crop before. He would sometimes come south in the evening not to work, but simply to sit on her porch and talk as the light died. They talked about farming and about the territory, and about history and books, and the things they had believed when they were younger that they no longer believed. They talked about their families and their failures, and their private theories about the way things worked. They talked, in other words, the way people talk when they are not being careful anymore, when they have decided without quite deciding that the other person is safe. One evening in the middle of August, when the sky was going spectacular in the west and the air smelled of cooling earth and sage, Emmett said, quietly and without preamble, "I would like to court you properly, Lucy, if you are willing." She looked at the sky for a moment. The red was deep and the gold was brilliant and the mountains were going purple at their bases. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." He looked at her and she looked at him, and it was entirely simple. He brought her wildflowers the next morning, picked from the hillside above the valley, a practical and slightly awkward bouquet of things he had clearly gathered himself with no experience in bouquet making, Indian paintbrush and blue grama grass and the last of the late phlox, held together with a piece of twine. It was, she thought, the most honest bouquet she had ever received, because it looked exactly like a man who had never gathered flowers for a woman in recent memory, and had done it anyway. She put them in a tin cup with water and set them on the table where she could see them while she worked. He was careful with her. He did not rush. He understood, without being told, that she was navigating something that required balance, the past she had loved and the present she was discovering, and that both deserved respect. He brought himself as he was, plainly and without pretense, and what he was turned out to be more than enough. They rode together on Sunday afternoons when the week's work allowed it, following the creek through the valley and up into the foothills, where the aspens were beginning to turn gold at the edges, and they talked and they were quiet, and once, on a high open meadow where the view took in the whole valley and the mountains beyond, he reached over and took her hand as they sat with their horses side by side, and she let him, and neither of them said anything about it because nothing needed to be said. She was not finished grieving Thomas. She understood this clearly, and she suspected that she was never going to be finished entirely, which was not a failure but simply the nature of love that has been genuine. But grief and new feeling were not mutually exclusive. She was finding they could coexist in the same heart if the heart was large enough and honest enough, and hers was both. Thomas himself, she believed, would have wanted her to be honest about it. He had been too practical a man to want her to perform sorrow at the expense of living. She thought she would tell Emmett about this when it felt right. Not yet, but eventually. September came in on a cool morning with the first real hint of autumn, and Lucy sent a final letter to Cimarron, saying she was ready for the children to come. Mrs. Appling hired a driver she trusted to bring them out in her wagon, which took 2 days but was safe and straightforward. And on a bright Thursday morning in the second week of September, Lucy heard the wagon coming down the valley track, and she walked out into the yard with her heart beating in a way she recognized, which was the particular rhythm of someone about to see the people they love most. Will climbed down first, before the wagon fully stopped, because he was 9 and could not wait, and he ran across the yard with his hat falling off his head and hit her so hard she staggered back a step, and held him and felt the enormity of having been separated from him for 3 months in the middle of her chest like a second heartbeat. Clara came down more carefully, in the manner of a 7-year-old who has decided to maintain composure, and then compromised entirely when she got close enough and buried her face in Lucy's skirt, and cried for about 30 seconds before collecting herself with great dignity. Lucy held them both for a long time in the September morning, with the valley green around them and the mountains bright against the blue sky, and she did not try to say anything for a while because there was nothing to say that they did not already know. When they finally separated and she wiped Clara's face and straightened Will's hat, she looked up and found Emmett standing at the edge of the yard, 20 feet away, where he had come to help with any unloading and had stopped when he saw the reunion, giving them their space with the same considerate instinct he brought to everything. Will saw him and looked at Lucy. "Is that the man from the road?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "That is Mr. Emmett Watkins. He has the property on the north end." Will studied him with the serious, thorough assessment of a boy who has been the man of the household for 8 months. Emmett met the assessment without flinching, which was the right response. "He helped you?" Will asked. "Considerably," Lucy said. Will walked across the yard to Emmett and looked up at him and put out his hand, and Emmett shook it with the same gravity he would have used with a grown man. "Thank you for helping my mother," Will said. "She did most of the helping herself," Emmett said. "I was mainly extra labor." Will considered this and seemed to find it acceptable. Clara, who had come to stand beside Lucy, watched Emmett with large brown eyes and said nothing, but did not look away, which with Clara was a form of approval. The autumn unfolded with the richness of a harvest that had not been certain, and therefore felt earned in a way that ordinary harvests did not. The beans came in full, and the squash filled the root cellar, and the corn from behind the barn was better than anything Lucy had grown in the previous 5 years. Emmett's Milo came in heavy and his corn was excellent, and he sold half of each crop to buyers in Cimarron at prices that were, given the general narrative about the flooded valley, somewhat surprising to those buyers who had expected poor yields. The valley's narrative was changing. Word got around, as it does in small territories, that the Garner and Watkins properties in the Mora Valley had not only survived the flooding but had come back stronger, and that the soil was exceptional, and that Dalton Prute's various efforts to acquire the deeds had been unsuccessful. Prute himself retreated from the valley, redirecting his interests elsewhere, which was a relief that Lucy registered without celebration, because celebrating someone's absence seemed undignified. Will turned out to be, as Lucy had suspected, genuinely useful. He had his father's practical intelligence and his mother's stubbornness, which was an excellent combination for homestead work, and by the 3rd week of September he had repaired the split rail fence on the east pasture, helped Emmett mend the roof of the barn, and become deeply interested in Emmett's system for rotating crops. He and Emmett talked farming in the evenings on the porch with an earnestness that Lucy found both touching and faintly amusing, and she could see that Will was making his assessment of Emmett the same way he assessed everything, thoroughly, and without rushing to conclusion. Clara found the young red-tailed hawks, exactly as Lucy had said she might, and named them both without regard for whether they were male or female or could be told apart. She named one Susanna and one Captain, and she spent significant portions of her free time sitting very still at the base of the cedar watching them. October arrived, and with it the aspen gold that swept down from the mountains in waves, and the air turned sharp, and the evenings came early, and the wood smoke from the house chimney rose straight up into blue sky on still mornings. The harvest was complete, and the root cellar was full, and the winter preparations were underway, and the valley had the settled, completed feeling of a thing that has been difficult and has been done. On an evening in the second week of October, Emmett came to the house for supper, which had become a regular occurrence on Sundays, and after Will and Clara were in bed, Lucy and Emmett sat at the table with coffee in the lamplight, and he said, looking at his coffee cup, "I have been thinking about something." "Tell me," she said. He looked up. "I would like to ask your permission to propose marriage. But I want to ask your permission before I propose, because the proposal itself should be something you can answer with complete freedom, and I think asking permission first gives you more freedom than asking cold." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight. He was entirely serious and entirely sincere and was watching her with those gray-green eyes that had not changed since the first evening on the road. "You are asking permission to ask," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, feeling the weight and the rightness of it simultaneously. "That is a very careful thing to do," she said. "I am a careful person," he said. "Yes," she said, "you are." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I want to talk to you about something first, about Thomas." "All right." "I loved him. I want you to understand that I loved him completely and that it was real. What I had with him was real, and I am not going to pretend it was not or diminish it because it is easier. He was a good man who loved me and who built something here, and part of my reason for staying when they told me to sell was because I owed it to him to keep what he built." "I know," Emmett said. "I have understood that from the beginning." "But," she continued, "I have also been honest with myself that I am a living woman and that I am capable of loving again, and that loving again does not erase what came before. It is," she paused, "the land is big enough to hold more than one kind of crop, and so is a person." He looked at her quietly. "I have come to love you," she said. "I want to be clear about that before anything else. I am not making a practical arrangement. I am telling you that I love you." He said nothing for a moment, and she could see him absorbing it the same way he absorbed everything, completely and without performance. Then he said, "Lucy." He said it the way you say the name of someone when the name is itself a complete sentence. "May I ask you to marry me?" "Yes," she said. "You may." He reached across the table and took her hands. His hands were large and warm and rough and entirely steady, and she looked at them holding hers and felt something settle into place inside her with a solidity that was not like a door closing but like a foundation being finished, complete and sound and ready to hold whatever was built on top of it. "Then will you marry me?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I will." He smiled at her then with the full smile that transformed his face, and she smiled back with equal sincerity. And outside the window the October sky was full of stars, and the coyotes were singing on the far ridge, and the aspen leaves rattled in the cold air with a sound like careful applause. They told Will and Clara the next morning at breakfast. Clara said, "Does this mean he will live here?" "Yes," Lucy said. Clara considered this. "Can he fix the latch on the garden gate? It is very stiff." "I will fix it this afternoon," Emmett said. Clara seemed satisfied. She resumed eating her biscuit. Will was quiet for longer. Lucy watched him without pushing, knowing he needed the time he needed. He was looking at the table, and she could see him working through something the way he always worked through things, systematically and with full attention. Finally, he looked up at Emmett. "My father built this house," he said. "I know," Emmett said. "He built it very well. We do not forget him." "Will," Lucy said gently. "It is all right," Emmett said to her and to Will. He looked at the boy with full attention. "I would not ask you to forget him. I knew from the first time I saw this house that it was built by someone who cared about it. Your father cared about your mother and about you and about this land. I intend to care about those same things. I'm not trying to replace anyone. I am asking to be added." Will considered this for a long time. Then he said he would have liked you. It was, Lucy thought, the most important thing anyone said that morning. They were married in Cimarron in November, on a cold, clear day when the mountains were white with early snow, and the sky was so blue it looked like something painted by a person with ambition beyond their skill, too brilliant and perfect to be quite real. Mrs. Appling cried. Will stood straight and serious in his best clothes, and was the one who walked Lucy from the doorway of the church to where Emmett stood, because he had asked to do this, and she had said yes without hesitation. Clara wore a dress that Mrs. Appling had made her, blue to match the sky, she said, and she carried a handful of dried flowers from the kitchen garden with the solemn dignity of a 7-year-old doing an important job. The minister was a Methodist circuit rider named Connolly, who had been marrying and burying people across the territory for 20 years, and he performed the ceremony with a brevity and a sincerity that Lucy appreciated, because she had always found that the longest ceremonies said the least. When Emmett put the ring on her finger, a simple band of silver that he had made by the silversmith in Cimarron, and that had a single small turquoise stone, which he said he thought matched the territory and also her eyes, which were not quite blue and not quite gray. She felt it as she had hoped to feel it, as the settling of something that had been unsettled, the completion of a pattern that she had not known was incomplete until she was in the middle of completing it. "You may kiss your bride," Minister Connolly said, and Emmett kissed her gently and properly, and she kissed him back, and Mrs. Appling cried harder, and Clara said "Mama" in a tone of pure satisfaction, and Will smiled, and it was, all of it, exactly right. They moved Emmett's belongings and his livestock and his farm equipment to the Garner property in the weeks following the wedding, which required several trips and considerable reorganization of the barn. His roan mare moved into the stall beside Lucy's borrowed horse, which she had by now purchased from Mrs. Appling as a permanent arrangement, and the two animals regarded each other with the cautious diplomatic interest of neighbors who have decided to get along. Emmett sold his 40 acres on the north end to a young family from Missouri named Cartwright, who had come west looking for exactly the kind of ground the valley offered, and he sold it at a fair price without inflating it, because he said a fair price brought good neighbors, and good neighbors were worth more than the difference. The Cartwrights moved in the following spring and proved him right. The winter of 1879 and 1880 was cold but not cruel, and the house held it well, as Thomas had built it to do. They added a second room to the east end of the house in December, because the family needed the space and Emmett knew how to build, and Will helped, and it was during those weeks of building together that Lucy watched her son and her husband develop something that was its own thing, not father and son in the original sense, but a genuine and particular bond between two people who appreciated each other. Emmett taught Will about the Milo crop and about crop rotation, and about reading the sky for weather in the way old-timers had learned to read it, and Will taught Emmett the particular geography of the east pasture and the creek behavior, and the places where the deer ran in the evenings, because Will had memorized the land the way children memorize beloved places. They were not always easy with each other. There were evenings when Will was quiet and withdrawn in a way that Lucy knew was about Thomas, and Emmett gave those evenings room without withdrawing, staying present but not pressing, and she loved him for knowing how to do that. Clara showed no ambivalence whatsoever about the new arrangement. She adopted Emmett with the wholehearted and unsentimental practicality of a 7-year-old who has decided a person is suitable, and she began appearing at his elbow whenever he was doing something interesting, which he allowed with patient good nature. He fixed the garden gate latch the day after the wedding, and Clara inspected the repair with the critical attention of a property owner, declared it satisfactory, and moved on to her next concern, which was whether they were going to get chickens in the spring. They did get chickens in the spring. 12 of them from a farmer in the valley who was selling off his flock, and Clara named every one of them and kept a careful tally of the eggs in a notebook that Emmett brought her from Cimarron, which she said was her farm ledger and which was treated with corresponding seriousness. The spring of 1880 brought the second year of crops on the flood-enriched soil, and the yields were extraordinary. The corn was better than the previous fall. The beans ran up their poles with extravagant abundance. Emmett put in a proper field of milo for the first time on the south end of the property, where the soil was the deepest, and it came up thick and green and looked, he said, like Missouri had always wanted to look but had never quite managed. Lucy planted a flower bed along the front of the house in April. It was not a practical decision. It was entirely an aesthetic one, and she made it without apology, because she had spent enough of her energy on practical decisions, and she was going to have phlox and asters and the wild roses she transplanted from the hillside, and she did. The green door, which Emmett had repaired and rehung properly on its frame in December, was surrounded by spring flowers by June, and it looked the way the house had always been supposed to look, the way Thomas had imagined it would look when he painted the door that color in the first place. She stood in the yard on a June afternoon and looked at the door and the flowers and the mountains beyond, and she felt both losses and gains simultaneously, which was, she had come to understand, simply what a full life felt like. Not happiness without shadow, but something richer and more honest than that. The knowledge that you had stayed, that you had done the work, that the thing you waited for had come. Emmett came out of the barn and crossed the yard to where she stood, and without asking what she was looking at, he stood beside her and looked at the same thing. He would have liked the flowers, she said. Yes, Emmett said. He would. She leaned into him slightly, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there looking at the door that Thomas had painted green, and the flowers that Lucy had planted, and the mountains that belonged to neither and both of them, and the valley spread out behind them rich and recovered and entirely, completely alive. By the summer of 1880, Lucy knew she was expecting another child. She told Emmett on a quiet evening in July, sitting on the porch in the warm dusk, and she watched his face move through surprise into something that was entirely and unguardedly joyful, the kind of joy that a person cannot perform, only feel. He took her hand. "How are you feeling?" "Tired in the mornings," she said. "Fine the rest of the time. We should make sure you are not overworking." "I am a farmer in the growing season," she said. "I will work as much as is sensible and no more." He looked at her with a slight smile. "Are you going to let me fuss over you even a little?" "You may fuss in moderation," she said. "I will tell you when moderation has been exceeded." He laughed, and she laughed with him, and the evening settled around them warm and easy. She told Will and Clara the following week. Clara's immediate response was to ask if it would be a girl, because she had, she informed them, been wanting a sister for some time. Will asked several practical questions about sleeping arrangements and timelines, and whether there would still be room in the barn for all their animals, which Emmett answered with complete seriousness, because Will's questions deserved serious answers. The baby arrived on a cold night in late February of 1881, in the house that Thomas built, attended by Mrs. Appling, who had come out on the stage from Cimarron and who proved, as Lucy had suspected she would, to be entirely competent in the matter. It was a hard night and a long one, but Lucy Garner had endured worse and knew how to endure things, and when it was over and the cold dawn light was coming through the bedroom window, she was holding a son. He was broad-shouldered from the start, which Emmett said was a family trait, and which Mrs. Appling said was because his mother had worked too hard all winter, and he had a head of dark hair and the gray-green eyes that were Emmett's exactly. Clara came in when it was light enough to come in, took one look at the baby and said with only very slight disappointment, "He is a boy." "He is," Lucy said. Clara considered for a moment. "He is very small," she said, in the tone of someone making the best of a situation. "Can I hold him?" "Carefully," Lucy said, "and with help from Emmett." Emmett settled the baby into Clara's arms with his hands underneath hers, and Clara looked down at the face of her new brother with an expression that moved from resignation through curiosity to something that was clearly and helplessly love, and she said, "Hello, I am your sister Clara. I am going to teach you everything." Will stood in the doorway and watched and did not say anything for a long time, and then he came in and looked at the baby and looked at his mother and said, quietly, "He looks like you." And then after a pause, and like Mr. Emmett. "He does," Lucy said. Will nodded, accepting this with the finality of someone who has worked something through completely. He put his hand on Emmett's arm briefly, not quite a hug but close, and Emmett put his hand over Will's for a moment, and that was all it took. They named the baby Thomas James Watkins. Thomas for the man who had built the house and broken the ground, and James for Emmett's father. It was Lucy's idea, and Emmett had said yes immediately, without hesitation, which was, she thought, exactly who he was. The valley was beginning its third year of recovery, though recovery was perhaps the wrong word now, because recovery implied returning to a previous state, and what the Mora Valley had done was not return to what it was but become something better. The soil that the flood had enriched was producing at levels that the pre-flood land had never matched. The Cartwright family on the north end had put in a wheat field that was the envy of the territory. 3 other families had come into the valley in the preceding 2 years, drawn by word of the extraordinary agricultural conditions, and there was talk in Cimarron of the Mora Valley becoming one of the most productive farming areas in New Mexico territory. Dalton Pruitt's name came up occasionally in conversations around the territory, usually in connection with some scheme elsewhere that was working out to no one's particular advantage except possibly his own, and possibly not even that. He did not come back to the valley. Lucy suspected he had decided that the people who remained on the Mora Valley land were more trouble than they were worth, which was, she thought, a fair assessment. On a September afternoon in 1881, when baby Thomas was 7 months old and fat and cheerful and deeply interested in everything, Lucy stood on the ridge above the valley for the first time since that first day she had stood there and looked down at the flood. She had not planned to come up here. She had come out to check the east fence line where Will had reported a gap, and she had found herself climbing the familiar trail to the top without quite deciding to. She stood on the ridge and looked down at the valley. The house was white against the green, with the green door bright even from this distance, and the flower bed a blur of late-season color along the front. The barn was solid and the corral was full, and the fields behind the house were the rich, dark green of Milo in late summer. Emmett's horse and hers grazed in the east pasture with the 2 milk cows they had added in the spring. Smoke came from the chimney in the thin, straight column of a slow-burning afternoon fire. Below and north, she could see the Cartwright wheat standing golden in the early autumn light, and beyond that the ridge of mountains, always the mountains, permanent and indifferent to everything human and beautiful because of it. She heard a horse on the trail behind her and did not reach for the rifle this time. She knew the sound of the roan. Emmett came up beside her and looked at what she was looking at, and she felt rather than saw him take in the whole picture, the house and the fields and the valley and the mountains, and she felt him understand what it meant that she was standing here again on this ridge where she had stood in the first desperate clarity of the flood and told her children that the water would fall. "The water fell," she said. He took her hand. "Yes," he said. "It fell." She looked at him. He was looking at the valley, and the September light was on his face, the light that made everything look both particular and eternal, and she thought that she had been right about him from the first moment on the road, that first evening when he had said "so do I," and she had spent 2 weeks in Cimarron thinking about what he meant by it. He had meant exactly what she had thought he meant. He had meant that he too knew how to wait for something worth waiting for. He had meant that he too had the patience and the will to stay in place when staying was the hardest thing. He had meant that he recognized in her something he had been looking for without quite naming it, the same way she had recognized it in him, that mutual recognition that had nothing to do with circumstance and everything to do with character. She had been right, and the rightness of it had only grown more evident in every month since. "Come down," he said. "We'll found some late apples on the South Hill, and Clara has decided to make a pie. She has Thomas in a sling on her back while she tries to roll the pastry. It is both admirable and somewhat alarming." Lucy laughed, and the laugh rang out clean over the valley below. "She is 7, she said. "She is 7 with absolute confidence," Emmett said, "which is at least half of what you need." They turned together from the ridge and began the descent back into the valley, his hand finding hers on the trail. And behind them the mountains stood in their ancient permanence, and the sky above the Mora Valley was the deep, brilliant blue of a September afternoon in New Mexico Territory, 1881. And below them the valley floor was green and gold and full of everything that had been waited for and worked for and refused to be surrendered. The house with the green door sat solid and sound in the afternoon light, and from inside it, faint but clear, came the sound of Clara singing something to the baby as she worked, and the sound of Will's voice answering something from outside, and the smell of wood smoke and apples, and all of it, every bit of it, was real and present and theirs, earned by patience and stubbornness, and the particular kind of love that says I will stay, and stay, and stay, until the water falls and the ground is solid, and the thing worth building can be built. Thomas James Watkins grew into a boy who looked startlingly like his father, gray-green eyes and all, and who had his mother's stubbornness and his father's deliberateness in equal measure. He turned 2 and then 3, and by the time he was 4, he was following Emmett through the fields the way Will had once followed Thomas, carrying things he was not quite strong enough to carry and asking questions at a rate that exceeded any one person's ability to answer. Will, at 13, was already the best farmer of his age in the valley, which anyone who knew the valley would tell you. He had his father's eye for land and his mother's understanding of when to push and when to wait, and he had the years of knowledge he had accumulated from Emmett, who gave it without reservation and without any of the territorial instinct that some men have about what they know. Will called Emmett by his first name still, and Emmett had never asked him to do otherwise, and in that space of mutual respect, something had grown that was exactly what it needed to be. Clara, at 11, had moved from farming to reading with the ferocity of someone who has discovered a new continent. She read everything she could find, which in the Mora Valley was limited but not as limited as you might expect, because Mrs. Apoling sent books on the stage when she came across them, and Emmett ordered things from the bookseller in Santa Fe when he was in Cimarron for supplies. Clara read history and natural philosophy and the novels of the previous generation, and she had opinions about everything she read, and she shared those opinions at the dinner table with a confidence that her mother recognized and her stepfather found genuinely entertaining. The Mora Valley in 1883 was a different place from the flooded silence of 1879. There were 7 families farming there now, all doing well on the rich silt soil that the Great Flood had deposited. There was a school, built by the Valley families collectively, where a young teacher named Miss Delmer from Kansas taught 30 children in a single room with a dedication and a competence that Lucy admired enormously. Clara was her best student. Will attended when the season allowed it. Thomas attended eagerly because Miss Delmer had a collection of illustrated natural history books that he found mesmerizing. The school had been Lucy's particular project. She had organized the families, managed the logistics, written the letters to the Territorial Education Office, and overseen the construction with the same focused competence she brought to everything. And when the school was finished and the first day of classes came, She stood in the doorway and felt a satisfaction that she ranked among the most complete she had experienced. Alongside the completion of the drainage channel and the first autumn harvest, and the morning she had found the house still standing after the flood. Emmett had done the framing on the school building, with Will and young Henry Cartwright helping, and he had refused any payment for it, saying that a community that educated its children was a community worth living in, and that his contribution was an investment in his own future as much as anyone else's, which was both the practical and the true thing to say. On a December evening in 1883, sitting at the table after the children were in bed, Lucy and Emmett talked about the years that had passed, the way people do at the end of year when the dark comes early and the fire is warm and there is no urgency to be anywhere else. "For years," she said. "From the flood," he said. "From the road," she said, "the first time." He looked at her across the table with the look he had that she had come to think of as his particular look for her, steady and warm and privately delighted, as if he was still, after 4 years and 3 children and 4 harvests and one very alarming spring storm that took part of the barn roof, still finding her interesting. She thought she would keep that look for as long as she could. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the spring." "What about it?" "I would like to put in an orchard, apple and cherry, on the south slope above the house where the sun exposure is longest." He looked at his coffee. "It will take 4 or 5 years before they bear properly, maybe longer," she smiled. "I know how to wait," she said. He looked up and smiled back, and the line between them was as clear as the first time he had said "so do I," which was still there, underneath everything that had been built on top of it. "So do I," he said, "now more than ever." The fire crackled and the wind moved outside the house, cold off the mountains, and the valley was quiet under the winter stars, and the house with the green door held all of them, all of what had been lost and all of what had been found, and there was not a thing about it that was not exactly as it should be. In the spring, they planted the orchard. The apple trees went in first, small bare root whips that looked improbable in the turned earth of the south slope, 12 of them in 2 rows, each one placed by Emmett and dug in by Will, and watered by Clara and watched over by Thomas, who was convinced the process was taking too long and checked the trees each morning for signs of progress. The cherry trees went in a week later, 8 of them, and Lucy planted them herself while Emmett held Thomas on his shoulders so the boy could see. And the afternoon was warm, and the soil was the dark, rich Mora Valley soil that had given everything back and more. And she pressed each small tree into it with the same hands that had pressed seeds into it for 5 years running, and thought that patience and love were perhaps finally the same thing when you had done both long enough. 4 years later, the apple trees bore their first full crop, in September of 1887, when Will was 17, and Clara was 15, and Thomas was 6, and Lucy and Emmett were well past the age of being surprised by each other, and had arrived at the place that is even better than surprise, which is the place of deep and seasoned knowing, where you understand a person's silences as well as their words and their habits as well as their intentions, and love them more rather than less for all of it. The apples were red and heavy and excellent, and Clara made a pie, which was by this point not alarming but entirely accomplished, and they ate it on the porch in the September light with the mountains going golden in the afternoon, and Thomas ate 3 pieces, and Will said it was the best thing he had ever tasted, and Emmett looked at Lucy across the table and said nothing at all, which was, as it had always been with him, sometimes the most eloquent thing of all. They had stayed. That was the essential fact of it. They had looked at the water covering the land and they had said the water will fall, both of them, separately and then together, and they had been right. And the falling of the water had revealed not only the soil they had hoped for but everything that had been possible underneath, all of it waiting, the way good things wait, patient and solid and entirely real, for the people who are willing to wait alongside them. The valley was full. The valley was, by any measure that mattered, exactly what they had always known it was going to be, underneath everything from the beginning. And the house with the green door stood at the center of it, the door that Thomas Garner had painted green because Lucy wanted something cheerful, and that Emmett Watkins had repaired and rehung properly, and that had since been repainted twice more, each time the same color, because some things, once you have them right, you do not change. Lucy Garner Watkins stood at that door on the last evening of September 1887 and looked out at the valley, at the harvest completed and the orchard heavy with late apples and the mountains white at their peaks with the first early snow, and she felt the fullness of it, all of it, without reservation or remainder, and she thought that this was what it meant to have stayed, not to have avoided the flood, but to have been there when the water fell, and to have been ready for what the falling revealed. She heard boots on the porch boards behind her and felt him beside her without turning, because she always knew the sound of him, would know it anywhere. And she leaned back slightly, and he put his arm around her, and they stood together in the doorway of the house that had been built for her by one good man, and had been rebuilt, in every way that mattered, by another. And the evening came on soft and gold over the Mora Valley, and there was nowhere either of them would rather have been, and nothing left that needed to be resolved, and the stars came out one by one over the mountains, and it was enough, it was more than enough, it was everything.